Guest, when someone you've known your whole life vanishes into the wilderness for 3 months, what goes through your mind?
Tony, I'll be honest with you. When JM walked into those mountains with nothing but his grandfather's rusty hammer and chisel, we all thought we were watching a 16-year-old boy march toward his death. The elders shook their heads. His mother cried for weeks. But I knew JM differently than most folks did. There was something burning in his eyes that summer, something ancient and determined. Still, when autumn came and went without a single sign of him, even I started preparing for the worst. Then one morning, he appeared at the village edge like a ghost, calloused hands stretched toward us, speaking words that changed everything. "I've built something you need to see."
But what exactly had he discovered up there that would shake an entire community to its core?
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Welcome back, guest. Last time we spoke about young JM's disappearance into the mountains, how the village search parties came back empty-handed after weeks of looking. But I sense there's more to this story, isn't there?
Oh, Tony, there's so much more. You see, what I didn't mention before is that JM wasn't just any ordinary mountain boy. Even as a child, there was something different about him, something that made the older folks in our village whisper when they thought no one was listening.
What kind of whispers, guest? What made this boy stand out from the others his age?
Well, for one thing, his grandfather was old Henrik the stoneworker. Now Henrik, he'd been carving memorial stones and foundation blocks for our village for nearly 60 years before he passed. But the strange thing was, Henrik always claimed his knowledge came from somewhere much older than any living person could teach.
Tell me more about this grandfather. What was it about Henrik that connected to JM's later, shall we call it his remarkable achievement?
Long pause, Henrik used to say that the mountain itself had taught him. I know how that sounds, Tony, but you have to understand our village sits in the shadow of Mount Korthak. It's an ancient place, older than our settlement, older than the Roman roads that used to run through these valleys. Henrik would take young JM up those slopes from the time the boy could barely walk.
And what did they do up there together? Was Henrik teaching the boy traditional stonework?
That's what we all assumed at first. Henrik would pack his tools, some bread and cheese, and off they'd go before dawn. Sometimes they'd be gone for days. JM's mother, bless her soul, she worried constantly. But Henrik always brought the boy back safe, and JM would return with the strangest stories.
What kinds of stories did young JM tell?
He'd talk about caves that seemed to breathe, about stone formations that looked like they'd been shaped by human hands but couldn't possibly have been. Most peculiar of all, he'd describe symbols carved into rock faces, symbols that seemed to shift and change when you weren't looking directly at them. The adults would smile and nod, thinking it was just a boy's imagination running wild in those vast mountain spaces.
But you don't think it was just imagination, do you, guest?
No, Tony, I don't, because Henrik started acting differently in his final years. He'd sit by his forge in the evenings, staring into the coals, mumbling words that didn't sound like any language I'd ever heard. And his work, his stonework, it became extraordinary, beautiful beyond anything he'd ever produced before.
How so? What changed about his craftsmanship?
The precision, Tony. The way he could split stone along lines so clean they looked like they'd been cut with a blade, sharper than any metal we'd ever seen. And the joints, the way one stone would fit against another, you couldn't slip a piece of parchment between them. Some of Henrik's final pieces are still standing in our village square, and after all these years, not a single stone has shifted or settled.
And young JM, he was learning these techniques from his grandfather?
Learning and surpassing them, if I'm being honest. By the time JM turned 14, he could work stone like Henrik, maybe even better. But there was something else developing in that boy. He'd spend hours just sitting on the mountainside, perfectly still, as if he was listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear.
Did anyone else in the village notice these changes in JM, his unusual abilities?
Oh, we all saw it, Tony. Hard to miss a 14-year-old boy lifting stones that should have taken 3 grown men to move. But you know how it is in small mountain villages. We're practical people. We see someone with a useful skill, we appreciate it. We don't ask too many questions about where the skill comes from.
Tell me about JM's family situation. You mentioned his mother. What about his father?
JM's father died when the boy was only 8. Mining accident in the lower tunnels. After that, it was just JM, his mother Elena, and old Henrik. Elena worked in the village as a seamstress, skilled with her hands just like the men in her family, but with fabric instead of stone. She worried about JM constantly, especially after Henrik passed when the boy was 15.
So JM lost his grandfather just a year before he disappeared into the mountains?
That's right. Henrik died in late autumn, just as the first snows were starting to dust the peaks. And Tony, the way that old man died, it was strange. Elena found him in his workshop one morning, sitting upright in his chair, tools laid out perfectly on his workbench. He looked peaceful, like he'd simply decided it was time to rest. But there was something new in his workshop that morning.
What did she find?
Drawings, Tony. Detailed sketches of architectural plans like nothing anyone in our village had ever seen. Not simple buildings, but elaborate structures with towers, courtyards, defensive walls. The drawings were incredibly detailed, showing joinery techniques and engineering solutions that seemed far too advanced for our little mountain community.
And what happened to these drawings?
Elena gave them to JM, of course. They were clearly meant for him. Henrik had written the boy's name at the top of each page in that careful script of his. JM studied those drawings through the entire winter after his grandfather's death. He'd sit by the fire night after night, tracing the lines with his finger, memorizing every detail.
How did the village react to JM during this period? He must have been grieving, but also absorbing all this complex information.
The boy became even quieter than before, if you can imagine that. He'd still help his mother, still do odd jobs around the village, but you could see his mind was elsewhere. Sometimes you'd catch him staring up at the mountain with such intensity, like he was having a conversation with someone up there in those stone peaks.
Did he give any indication that spring about what he was planning? Any hint that he was preparing for such an ambitious undertaking?
Looking back, Tony, there were signs. Small things that didn't seem significant at the time. He started asking the blacksmith about different types of metal, about tempering techniques for tools. He spent time with the rope maker, learning about various knots and load-bearing capacities. He even talked to the village hunters about preserving food for extended periods in the wilderness.
So he was methodically preparing, gathering knowledge from various craftspeople in the village.
Exactly. And he was testing himself physically too. We'd see him carrying heavier and heavier loads up the mountain paths. He'd disappear for days at a time, always returning with calloused hands and stories about finding the perfect quarry sites, places where the stone was strong but workable.
What did his mother Elena think about all this preparation?
Elena was torn, Tony. Part of her was proud to see her son developing such dedication and skill. But another part of her, the part that had already lost a husband to the mountain, was terrified. She tried talking to some of the village elders about her concerns, but what could they do? JM wasn't breaking any laws. He wasn't endangering anyone but himself.
And then came that morning in early spring when he finally left. Tell me about that day, guest.
Pause. It was just after the snowmelt, when the mountain streams were running high and fast. Elena woke to find JM already dressed, his pack loaded with tools and supplies. He kissed her forehead and told her not to worry, that he'd be back before the first autumn frost. Those were his exact words, Tony. Before the first autumn frost.
Did he say anything else? Any indication of where exactly he was going or what he planned to build?
Just one thing, and it gave Elena chills at the time. He said he was going to build something that would keep the village safe for generations to come. When she asked him safe from what, he looked at her with those serious dark eyes of his and said that Henrik had shown him things in the mountain that most people weren't ready to understand.
That's a rather cryptic statement for a 16-year-old boy to make.
JM was never really like other 16-year-olds, Tony. Even before his grandfather died, the boy carried himself like someone much older. He had a way of looking at you that made you feel like he could see straight through to your thoughts. It wasn't unsettling exactly, but it was noticeable.
So he left that morning, and the village began its long wait. How did people react during those first few weeks?
The first month, we were mostly confident he'd return soon. JM had always been self-sufficient in the mountains, and he'd never been gone longer than a week before. But as spring turned to summer, and summer began moving toward autumn, people started to worry in earnest.
Did anyone attempt to track him, to follow his path into the mountains?
Oh, many tried, Tony. The problem is that Mount Korthak is vast, with dozens of valleys and hidden approaches. JM knew those paths better than anyone, possibly even better than his grandfather had. The search parties would find traces here and there, tool marks on stone, cold fire pits, but nothing that led them to wherever he was working.
You mentioned earlier that there were sounds coming from deep in the mountain. Tell me more about that.
Pause. It started about 6 weeks after JM disappeared. People working in their gardens or hanging laundry would hear what sounded like rhythmic hammering echoing down from the peaks. Not random hammering, Tony, but methodical, purposeful. Like someone working to a very specific plan, the sound would carry on mountain winds, sometimes loud enough to wake people at night.
Did these sounds concern the villagers, or were they reassuring?
Both, really. On one hand, it meant JM was alive and working. On the other hand, the scale of what we were hearing suggested something far beyond what one person should be able to accomplish. The hammering would go on for hours, sometimes from dawn to dusk, with a precision that seemed almost mechanical.
And as autumn approached, as the time JM had promised to return drew near, what was the mood in the village?
Tense, Tony. Very tense. Elena had grown thin with worry, barely eating, spending most of her time staring up at the mountain. The other villagers tried to comfort her, but honestly, we were all beginning to fear the worst. Mountain accidents happen, especially when someone's working alone with heavy stone and metal tools.
But then he returned, just as he'd promised.
Long pause he did, Tony. On the last day of September, just as the leaves were beginning to turn, JM walked back into our village. But he wasn't the same boy who'd left 6 months earlier.
How had he changed?
Physically, he'd grown taller, broader through the shoulders, with muscles like a man twice his age. His hands were scarred from constant work with stone and metal. But it was more than that, Tony. There was something in his eyes, a depth that hadn't been there before, like he'd seen things during those months in the mountain that had aged him in ways that had nothing to do with time.
And what did he tell the village about what he'd accomplished up there?
That's just it, Tony. He didn't tell us anything at first. He simply said he'd built something he wanted to show us, something that might change how we thought about our place in this valley. When people pressed him for details, he'd just smile and say we needed to see it for ourselves to believe it.
So the stage was set for this remarkable revelation. The village was about to discover what one determined boy had accomplished in those hidden mountain reaches.
Indeed, Tony. And none of us, not even those who knew JM best, were prepared for what we found when he finally led us up that mountain path. What we discovered challenged everything we thought we knew about building, about history, and about the secrets that our mountain had been keeping for longer than anyone could remember.
We've been talking about young JM's disappearance, but I'm curious about what led up to that moment. What was life like in your village before he vanished into those mountains?
Our village sits in a valley that's been carved out by centuries of wind and water, Tony. When you stand at the well in the center of town, you can see the mountains rising up on all sides like the walls of some great cathedral. The peaks catch the morning light first, and by evening, they cast shadows so long they seem to reach right into your hearth.
That's quite an image. And this is where JM grew up?
Born and raised. His father was our blacksmith, a man with hands like tree roots and a voice that could carry clear across the valley when he was working his forge. JM spent his childhood in that smithy, watching those massive arms shape iron into horseshoes, tools, whatever the village needed.
Tell me about the boy himself. What was he like before all this happened?
Pause. Quiet, but not in a shy way. More like he was always listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. He'd help his father at the forge, sure enough, but you could see his eyes wandering to those mountain peaks. Even as a small child, he'd ask questions that made the adults uncomfortable.
What kind of questions?
He'd want to know why the old-timers warned against going too deep into the mountains, why certain paths had names, but no one would speak them aloud, why his grandmother would cross herself whenever storm clouds gathered around the highest peak. Most children accept the world as it's given to them, but J.M. seemed to sense there were layers underneath.
His family must have noticed this tendency.
His mother did, certainly. She was a weaver, had fingers that could coax patterns from thread that seemed almost magical. She'd watched J.M. studying the designs in her tapestries, tracing them with his finger like he was trying to read some hidden language. She told me once that he'd spend hours sketching symbols in the dirt behind their cottage, symbols that looked almost familiar but not quite right.
Almost familiar. That's an interesting way to put it.
You have to understand, our village is old, Tony. Not the buildings themselves, they've been rebuilt many times over the years. But the settlement, the reason people first chose to live in this particular valley, that goes back further than anyone remembers. Sometimes when you're digging a new foundation or clearing a field, you'll find stones with markings carved into them. Ancient things.
And J.M. was drawn to these discoveries?
Like iron filings to a magnet. Whenever word spread that someone had unearthed one of these carved stones, J.M. would be there within the hour, crouched down studying every line and curve. The village elders didn't much care for it. They preferred to bury those stones again, quietly, without much discussion.
But J.M. had other ideas.
He started collecting rubbings. You know, laying parchment over the carvings and rubbing charcoal across the surface to capture the image. His mother found dozens of these rubbings hidden under his sleeping mat. When she brought them to his father, the man's face went pale as winter sky.
The blacksmith recognized something in those symbols?
Long pause. The blacksmith's family had lived in this valley for 7 generations. There are things you inherit along with the forge and the tools, Tony. Knowledge that gets passed down in whispers. His father made him promise to stop making the rubbings, made him swear to leave the old stones alone.
How did J.M. react to that?
Outwardly, he agreed. He was a dutiful son, always had been. But I think that's when he started making his plans. You could see a change in him over the following months. He became more focused, more deliberate in everything he did.
What do you mean by deliberate?
He started paying closer attention during his work at the forge. Not just hammering when his father told him to hammer, but studying the techniques, asking about different types of joints and metalwork. He'd volunteer for tasks that taught him carpentry, stonework, any skill that involved building or shaping.
Preparing himself.
That's how it seems now, looking back. At the time, we just thought he was becoming more serious about learning a trade. His father was pleased, thought the boy was finally settling into the life that had been laid out for him. But there were other signs that should have told us something deeper was stirring.
What kind of signs?
He started asking the old women about the stories. Our village has always had its share of widows who remember the tales their grandmothers told them. Stories about the time before, when the mountains held secrets that could change a man's fate. Most people listen to these stories the way you'd listen to fairy tales, but J.M. hung on every word like his life depended on it.
Did these stories mention anything about building, about construction?
Pause. There was one tale that old Martha used to tell, about a time when men knew how to coax the very stones of the mountain into serving them. She'd describe buildings that grew from the rock itself, as natural as trees but shaped by human will and ancient knowledge. Most of us assumed it was just the fancy of old age, but J.M. would ask her to repeat that particular story again and again.
His parents must have noticed his growing obsession with these tales.
His mother grew worried. I know that much. She came to see me several times in the weeks before he disappeared, asking if I'd noticed changes in her son's behavior. She said he'd started talking in his sleep, speaking words that didn't sound like any language she recognized.
That must have been deeply unsettling for her.
Terrifying, more like. In a small village, when the natural order of things starts to shift, everyone feels it, and J.M. had become something of a puzzle that none of us could solve. He was still the helpful, respectful young man he'd always been, but underneath there was this sense of purpose, that seemed too large for a 16-year-old boy to carry.
When did you first suspect he might actually leave?
The morning I saw him testing his pack. He'd filled it with tools from his father's shop and was walking around behind their cottage, adjusting the straps, checking the weight distribution. When he noticed me watching, he smiled and said he was thinking about taking some camping trips into the lower hills.
But you didn't believe him.
The look in his eyes, Tony. It wasn't the look of a boy planning a few nights under the stars. It was the look of someone preparing for a journey that might change everything. I should have said something to his parents that day, but sometimes when you sense that fate is moving, you hesitate to step into its path.
And 3 days later, he was gone.
3 days later, his mother found his bed empty and his pack missing, along with half the tools from the blacksmith's shop and enough supplies to last a determined young man quite some time in the wilderness.
Guest, I have to ask you about something that's been weighing on my mind since our last conversation. You mentioned that JM had been acting differently in the weeks before he disappeared into the mountains. What exactly did you notice?
Sighs deeply, Tony. It's hard to describe without sounding like I'm telling tales. But there was something in his eyes, you know, like he was seeing things the rest of us couldn't. My Martha first noticed it at the Autumn Harvest Festival. JM was standing by the old stone well, just staring at those weathered carvings our grandfathers used to joke about.
The carvings on the well? I don't think you've mentioned those before. What kind of symbols were they?
Ancient things, Tony. Spirals and interlocking circles, some kind of runic markings that nobody in the village could read. Most folks figured they were just decorative, maybe left by whoever built the well generations ago. But JM, he was tracing them with his fingertips like he was reading a book.
That must have been unsettling to witness. How did the other villagers react when they saw him doing this?
Pause. Well, old Henrik thought the boy was just being curious. You know how young minds work, always questioning things. But Elena, she's got that intuition about people. She pulled me aside and said something felt different about JM's interest. Said it reminded her of how her grandfather used to study those same markings before he passed.
Elena's grandfather. Was he someone significant in your community?
He was our village historian, Tony. Kept all the old stories alive. Talked about the mountain spirits and the ancient builders who supposedly lived in these hills long before any of us arrived. Most people thought his tales were just entertainment for the children, but Elena always insisted there was truth in them.
And what did Elena think JM was discovering in those stories?
She never said directly, but I remember her mentioning that her grandfather once told her the mountains held secrets. Not treasure, mind you, but knowledge. Ways of building and creating that had been lost to time. Pauses, the old man used to say, the stones themselves remembered how to fit together if you knew how to listen to them.
That's fascinating. So when JM gathered those simple tools and headed into the mountains, did anyone connect it to these stories Elena's grandfather used to tell?
Not at first. We were all too worried about a 16-year-old boy surviving alone in the wilderness. But now, looking back, I wonder if JM wasn't just wandering aimlessly. The tools he chose, Tony, they weren't random. A good chisel, a solid hammer, measuring ropes, and that old level his father had inherited from his own father.
It sounds like he was preparing for construction work rather than just exploring. Did his parents have any idea what he was planning?
His mother, Greta. She's been torn apart by guilt ever since. Keeps saying she should have asked more questions when she found him sketching in his journal late at night. But you have to understand, JM had always been a thoughtful child, always drawing or carving little figures from wood scraps.
What kind of sketches was he making? Did anyone get a look at his journal?
After he disappeared, Greta showed a few of us some drawings he'd left behind. Pause, Tony. These weren't the doodles of a village boy. They were architectural plans, detailed drawings of archways and stone joints, foundations and wall structures. The precision was remarkable for someone who'd never had formal training in building.
That must have been when people started to realize this wasn't an ordinary teenage adventure. How did the village respond to seeing those plans?
Fear, mostly. Henrik started talking about calling for help from the regional authorities. Some of the women wanted to organize search parties. But Elena, she convinced us to wait, said if the boy was truly following the old paths, we needed to trust that the mountains would either teach him or send him home.
Elena seems to have had unusual influence over these decisions. Was she considered some kind of spiritual leader?
Not spiritual exactly, but she carried her grandfather's wisdom. People respected her judgment about matters concerning the old ways. She reminded us that forcing our way into the mountains to find JM might disturb whatever process was unfolding.
That's quite a leap of faith for worried neighbors. Were there any signs during those 3 months that JM was still alive?
Strange things, Tony. Sounds echoing down from the high ridges on still mornings. Not quite human voices, but rhythmic, like work songs. And Marcus, who hunts in the lower foothills, he swore he could hear stone being cut and shaped when the wind was just right.
Did Marcus ever investigate these sounds more closely?
He tried once, but said the acoustics in those canyons play tricks on you. He'd follow what sounded like hammer strikes on stone, only to find empty valleys and wind-carved rock formations. But he did find something interesting about 6 weeks after JM had gone missing.
What kind of discovery?
Fresh tool marks on some of the stone outcroppings. Clean cuts that looked deliberate, like someone was quarrying specific shapes and sizes. Marcus said whoever was doing the work understood stone better than any mason he'd ever seen.
So there were signs that serious construction was happening somewhere in those mountains. Did this ease people's worries about JM's safety?
In some ways, yes. It meant he was alive and working, but it also raised bigger questions about how a village boy could have learned such advanced techniques. Pause. Elena started talking about gifts that awakened when someone was ready to receive them, old knowledge that could surface in the right person at the right time.
That suggests there were forces at work beyond normal learning and skill development. Looking back now, do you think the village was prepared for what JM would eventually reveal when he returned?
Long pause. Tony, I don't think any of us could have prepared for what that boy accomplished up in those mountains. We were expecting him to come home with some rough shelter, maybe a simple cabin. What he built defied everything we thought we knew about construction, about history, and about the secrets our mountains have been keeping all these years.
Guest, we've been talking about young JM's unusual habits, his solitary nature, and how the village folk viewed him. But something changed that spring, didn't it? Something that shifted everything.
Long pause. Yes, Tony. It was the morning after the spring festival. I remember it clearly because my wife had made extra bread for the celebration, and I was planning to take some to JM's family. When I arrived at their cottage, his mother Elena was standing in the doorway, holding a piece of torn cloth.
Torn cloth? What kind of cloth was it?
It was from JM's work shirt, the heavy brown one he wore when he was doing his carpentry. Elena's hands were shaking as she held it. She looked at me with these wide, frightened eyes and said, "He's gone, Thomas. He left before dawn, and all I found was this caught on the gatepost."
How did you respond to that news, Guest? What was your immediate reaction?
I'll be honest with you, Tony. My first thought was relief. I know that sounds terrible, but the boy had been acting so strangely in the weeks leading up to this, always muttering to himself, drawing those odd symbols in the dirt, staring up at the mountains like they were calling to him. Part of me thought maybe he just needed time away from the village.
But Elena didn't share that sentiment, I imagine.
Not at all. She grabbed my arm and said, "You don't understand, Thomas. He took his tools, all of them, the hammer his grandfather left him, the chisels he carved himself, even that strange measuring stick he made from mountain ash. Why would a boy take carpentry tools if he was just going for a walk?"
That's a fair point. Did she have any idea where he might have gone?
She kept pointing toward the high peaks, the ones we call the sleeping giants. He's been watching those mountains for weeks, she told me. Sometimes I'd catch him at his window before sunrise, just staring up there like he could see something the rest of us couldn't.
What did you make of that behavior, Guest? In your experience with JM, did that seem consistent with his character?
Pause, looking back now, yes. But at the time it worried me greatly. The sleeping giants aren't gentle hills, Tony. their harsh, unforgiving peaks. We'd lost shepherds up there, experienced men who knew the mountains. The idea of a 16-year-old boy heading into that wilderness with nothing but hand tools. It seemed like madness.
How did the rest of the village react when word spread about JM's disappearance?
Old Henrik, the blacksmith, he organized a search party within hours. Said it was our duty to bring the boy home before the mountain took him. But when we reached the tree line, we found something that stopped us cold.
What did you find?
Footprints, clear as day in the soft earth. But they weren't wandering or confused like you'd expect from a lost boy. These prints were purposeful, deliberate. They headed straight up the steepest face of the mountain, following what looked like an ancient path that most of us had never noticed before.
An ancient path? Can you describe what made it seem ancient?
The stones, Tony. They were placed too perfectly to be natural, worn smooth by centuries of weather, yet none of us could remember anyone mentioning this path before. Henrik stood there scratching his beard and said, "I've been hunting these mountains for 40 years, and I swear this trail wasn't here last season."
That must have been unsettling. How did the search party respond to that discovery?
We followed the path for maybe half a mile before it became too treacherous. The way ahead required climbing skills none of us possessed. Young Marcus, Henrik's apprentice, he volunteered to go further, but Henrik pulled him back. "That path leads to nothing but death," he said. "If the boy went that way, we'll be bringing back a body, not a person."
Did anyone suggest alternative theories about where JM might have gone?
Elena refused to accept Henrik's conclusion. She kept insisting her son was alive, that he had some purpose up there. "He's been preparing for something," she told us. "All those nights sharpening his tools, all those drawings he made of things I didn't recognize. My boy doesn't do anything without a reason."
What kind of drawings had she seen him making?
She described them as architectural sketches, but unlike anything we'd seen in our village. "Towers and walls," she said. "Stone arches that seemed to float in the air, and always those symbols carved into every surface. When we asked her to show us the drawings, she said JM had burned them all the night before he left."
He burned his own work? That seems significant.
"Very significant, Tony." Elena said she woke up around midnight to the smell of smoke. When she looked outside, JM was standing by a small fire in their garden, feeding papers into the flames. She called to him, but he acted like he didn't hear her, just kept burning page after page until nothing remained but ashes.
How long did the village continue searching for JM?
2 weeks of organized searches, then another month of individuals checking nearby valleys and caves. But as spring turned to early summer, people began to accept what seemed inevitable. Henrik started talking about holding a memorial service. Elena stopped coming to market. The whole village felt the weight of losing one of our own.
But Elena never gave up hope, did she?
Never. Every morning she'd climb to the highest point in the village and scan those mountains with her father's old spyglass. Neighbors started worrying about her sanity. Some suggested she needed to accept reality and begin the grieving process. But Elena would just shake her head and say, "A mother knows when her child is gone, and my JM is still out there."
3 months is a long time for someone to survive in those mountains with just hand tools.
Impossible, most of us thought. But, as we'll discover, Tony, impossible was exactly what JM was building up there in the Sleeping Giants.
Guest, we've been talking about JM's quiet nature, his skill with his hands. But something changed that spring, didn't it? Something that shattered the peaceful rhythm of your village life.
Long pause. It was the morning after the spring festival. I remember because my mother was still sweeping flower petals from our doorstep when old Henrik came running down the mountain path, shouting like his clothes were on fire.
Henrik was the shepherd, if I recall correctly from your earlier stories.
Yes, he'd been up in the high pastures with his flock since before dawn. Tony, I'd never seen that man move faster than a slow walk in all my years. But that morning, he was stumbling, falling, getting back up. His face was white as fresh snow.
What had he seen up there?
He burst into the village square, gasping for breath, pointing back toward the peaks. He kept saying the same thing over and over. The mountain's bleeding, the stones are weeping blood.
How did the villagers react to such a claim?
At first we thought the old man had finally lost his mind. My father stepped forward, tried to calm him down. But Henrik grabbed my father's shirt with both hands and said, "I'm telling you, the very rocks are splitting open and bleeding like fresh wounds."
That must have been terrifying for a young person to witness.
I felt my stomach drop, Tony. Not because I believed the mountain was bleeding, but because Henrik's fear was so real, so raw. When adults show that kind of terror, children feel it in their bones.
Did anyone else go up to investigate?
My father and 3 other men immediately started gathering rope and climbing gear. They were trying to stay calm, talking in low voices about rock slides and natural phenomena, but I could see their hands shaking as they prepared.
And JM? Where was he during all this commotion?
Pause. That's when we realized. In all the chaos, with Henrik's shouting and the men preparing to climb, someone called out for JM to bring his tools. They thought he might be useful if there were injured animals or damaged shelters up there.
But he didn't answer the call.
His mother went to their cottage and came back with her face twisted in confusion. She said his bed hadn't been slept in. His pack was gone. His hand tools, his hammer, his chisels, everything.
The timing couldn't have been coincidental.
Tony, that's when the real fear started. Not about bleeding mountains or Henrik's visions, but about a 16-year-old boy who'd vanished in the same night that something terrible had apparently happened up there.
How did JM's disappearance change the dynamic of the search?
Everything shifted. What had been a cautious investigation became a desperate rescue mission. The men were no longer just checking on Henrik's claims. They were racing against time to find a boy who might be trapped, injured, or worse.
What did they find when they reached the high pastures?
Voice drops. They found exactly what Henrik had described. But it wasn't blood, Tony. It was something far stranger. The rocks had split open in perfect lines, as if someone had taken a massive chisel and carved geometric patterns into the living stone. Red mineral veins were exposed, gleaming in the sunlight like fresh wounds.
Natural geological activity?
That's what my father wanted to believe. But the patterns were too precise, too deliberate. And there were marks in the stone, tool marks that looked impossibly clean and deep.
Any sign of JM?
Footprints leading higher up the mountain, much higher than anyone from our village had ever gone. The men followed them for hours until the trail disappeared into terrain so dangerous they couldn't risk going further.
How long did the search continue?
3 weeks, Tony. Every able-bodied person in the village took turns. We searched every cave, every ledge, every hidden valley we knew. But JM had simply vanished, as if the mountain had swallowed him whole.
That must have been devastating for his family, for the entire community.
His mother aged 10 years in those 3 weeks. The whole village carried this weight of guilt and helplessness. We'd lost one of our own to the mountain, and we couldn't even find his body to bring him home for proper burial.
When did you finally give up the search?
We didn't give up exactly. But after 3 weeks, with no trace, no hope, the village elder called us together. He said we had to accept that the mountain had claimed JM, just as it had claimed others before him.
But something tells me that wasn't the end of JM's story.
Pause. No, Tony. It was just the beginning of something none of us could have imagined.
Guest, we've talked about JM's incredible construction skills, but I'm curious about something deeper. How did the village folk really handle such a dramatic change? A boy disappearing for months, then returning with something that defied everything they understood about what was possible.
Long pause. You know, Tony, that's where the real story begins to unfold. See, people don't just marvel at impossibility and move on. They start asking questions that make them uncomfortable. Old Henrik, the village carpenter who'd been building homes for 40 years, he stopped eating for 3 days after seeing those perfectly fitted stone joints.
3 days? That sounds like more than professional jealousy.
Oh, it was much deeper than that. Henrik came to my father trembling like a leaf, saying he'd spent his whole life thinking he understood construction. Then this boy shows him work that would challenge master masons from the great cathedrals. Henrik kept asking, "How does a 16-year-old know techniques I've never seen? Where did he learn to cut stone like that?"
And your father, how did he respond to Henrik's crisis of confidence?
Pause. That's when we first saw the fear creeping in. My father tried to comfort Henrik, but I could see it in his eyes too. This wasn't just about building anymore. It was about the natural order of things being turned upside down. Children learn from adults, not the other way around. Apprentices don't surpass master craftsmen overnight.
You mentioned fear. What exactly were people afraid of?
Well, that's where the personal struggles really started surfacing. Take Martha, JM's own mother. She'd been grieving for 3 months, convinced her boy was dead in some mountain ravine. Then he walks back into her life. But he's different. Changed. She told my mother she barely recognized him.
Different how?
His hands, for one thing. They were scarred and calloused like a man who'd worked stone for decades. His eyes had this distant quality, like he'd seen things he couldn't talk about. And the way he moved, Tony, it was with this quiet confidence that unsettled people. Martha said it was like her boy had left, but a stranger wearing his face had returned.
That must have been devastating for her.
Voice softening. She started blaming herself, wondering if she'd failed as a mother somehow. Late at night, she'd walk past his room and listen to him talking in his sleep, but the words weren't in any language she recognized. The poor woman was torn between relief that he was alive and grief for the boy she felt she'd lost forever.
And what about JM himself? How was he handling all this attention and suspicion?
That's the heartbreaking part. He tried so hard to be the same cheerful boy everyone remembered, but you could see the weight he was carrying. When people asked him direct questions about how he'd learned such advanced techniques, he'd get this pained look and change the subject, like there were things he wanted to explain but couldn't find the words for.
Or perhaps things he wasn't allowed to explain.
Long pause, exactly. And that's when Thomas the blacksmith started noticing something else troubling. He'd been supplying tools to families for 20 years, knew every implement in the village. But when he examined JM's tools after the construction, some of them had markings he'd never made, small symbols etched into the metal.
Symbols? What kind of symbols?
Ancient-looking things. Spirals and geometric patterns that seemed to shift when you looked at them in different light. Thomas was certain he hadn't put them there, but JM insisted those were the same tools he'd taken into the mountains. The boy seemed genuinely confused about it, which made it even more unsettling.
So the community was fracturing under the weight of these mysteries.
People started choosing sides without realizing it. Some, like young Father Benedict, saw JM's work as a blessing, maybe even miraculous. Others, particularly the older generation, began whispering about things better left undisturbed. The mountain had always been a place of old stories and warnings passed down through generations.
What kind of warnings?
Voice-dropping tales about why certain areas were avoided, why shepherds never grazed their flocks above the tree line in specific valleys, stories about sounds that carried on windless nights and lights that moved where no traveler should be. Most folks had dismissed these as folklore, but suddenly they didn't seem so impossible anymore.
And caught in the middle of all this was a 16-year-old boy trying to readjust to normal life.
Precisely. The very people who should have been celebrating his return were instead treating him like a walking question mark. You could see him struggling with loneliness, even surrounded by his family and neighbors. Sometimes the greatest burden isn't what you've accomplished, Tony, but being unable to share the true weight of how you accomplished it.
Guest, we've talked about how JM built this impossible fortress, but I'm curious about something else. How did the villagers handle seeing their assumptions completely shattered?
Pause. That's the heart of it, isn't it, Tony? Here they'd spent 3 months convinced this boy was dead. Some had even started talking about memorial services.
And suddenly he's standing before them, very much alive, leading them to something that challenged everything they thought they knew about what was possible.
Exactly. But it wasn't just about being wrong about JM's fate. It was deeper than that. See, when people live in a small mountain village, they develop certain beliefs about limits, what one person can accomplish, what's realistic to expect.
So JM's fortress forced them to confront those beliefs.
Margaret, the baker's wife, she pulled me aside that first evening after we'd all returned from the mountain. Her hands were shaking as she kneaded dough. She said, "If a 16-year-old boy can build something like that, what have I been telling myself about my own limitations?"
That must have been unsettling for her.
Profoundly. She'd spent 40 years believing she was just a simple baker's wife. Nothing more, nothing less. But seeing what JM had accomplished with basic tools and determination, she started questioning everything she'd accepted about herself.
How did others respond to that kind of internal upheaval?
Old Henrik, the village elder, he became almost obsessive about understanding the construction techniques. He'd served in the military as a young man, worked on fortifications. He knew what kind of engineering JM's fortress represented.
And that knowledge troubled him?
It terrified him, Tony. Henrik started visiting the fortress daily, measuring walls, studying the stonework. His grandson told me Henrik would sit at his kitchen table late into the night, sketching diagrams, trying to work out how one person could have managed the logistics.
What was driving that obsession?
Henrik had always been the village's voice of practical wisdom. When young people had ambitious dreams, he'd gently guide them toward more realistic expectations. But JM had made Henrik's entire worldview seem small and limiting.
That's a heavy burden for someone who'd built their identity around being wise and practical.
The worst part was how it affected his relationship with his grandson. The boy, maybe 14 at the time, started looking at Henrik differently. Instead of seeking his grandfather's counsel, he'd ask, "But what if I'm like JM? What if I can do more than you think?"
So JM's achievement created ripple effects throughout the village relationships.
Long pause. Yes, and not all of them were positive, at least not initially. Families started having conversations they'd never had before, parents questioning whether they'd been too quick to discourage their children's ambitions.
You're suggesting that JM's fortress became a mirror for everyone's unrealized potential.
That's beautifully put, Tony. Elena, the seamstress, she'd always dreamed of designing elaborate tapestries, the kind you'd see in noble houses, but she'd convinced herself she was just meant to mend clothes and hem simple dresses.
What changed for her?
After seeing the fortress, she started sketching again. Intricate patterns, ambitious designs. Her husband found her one morning, surrounded by drawings, tears streaming down her face. When he asked what was wrong, she said, "I've wasted so many years being afraid of my own dreams."
These weren't just personal revelations, were they? The whole village dynamic was shifting.
The weekly gatherings at the tavern became intense discussions about possibility and limitation. Thomas, our blacksmith, started talking about techniques he'd only read about in old manuals. Sarah, the herb woman, began experimenting with remedies her grandmother had mentioned, but never taught her.
It sounds like JM had awakened something that had been sleeping in the community.
But here's what really concerns some of us, Tony. Along with this awakening came a restlessness. Young people started looking beyond the village boundaries with new hunger. Some of the older residents worried we were losing something essential about our way of life.
The stability that comes with accepting limitations.
Precisely. And then there were those strange symbols carved into the fortress walls. They seemed to whisper that JM's transformation wasn't entirely his own doing.
What did people make of those symbols?
Pause. That's where the real fear crept in, Tony. Because if JM had tapped into something ancient, something beyond normal human capability, then what exactly had been awakened in our quiet mountain village?
And that question would soon demand answers.
Whether we were ready for them or not.
Guest, when we last spoke, you were telling me about how the villagers discovered those ancient symbols carved into JM's fortress walls. I imagine that changed everything for the community.
Oh, Tony, it did more than change things. It split us right down the middle. Half the village wanted to tear down what JM had built, convinced he'd awakened something dangerous. The other half saw those symbols as proof that our mountains held secrets worth protecting.
And where did you find yourself in all of this? You'd known JM since he was small.
Long pause. That's what made it so hard, Tony. I kept thinking about the boy I'd watched grow up, always building little structures with sticks and stones. But those symbols, they weren't the work of any 16-year-old, no matter how gifted.
Tell me more about these symbols. What exactly did they look like?
Ancient spirals, interlocking circles, and what looked like mountain peaks with lines radiating from them. But it was the way they were carved that unsettled people. Perfect depth, perfect spacing. Like they'd been cut by someone who'd been carving stone for decades, not months.
How did JM respond when people questioned him about the symbols?
That's when we started seeing a different side of him, Tony. The boy who'd left our village had been eager to please, always smiling. The young man who came back, he had this quiet intensity. When the village elder asked him directly about the symbols, JM just said they'd come to him in dreams.
Dreams. That must have been unsettling for the adults to hear.
Marcus, our blacksmith, he laughed outright, said no dream ever taught a man to carve stone like that, but JM didn't get defensive. He just looked at Marcus with these calm eyes and said, "Sometimes dreams remember things we've forgotten."
What do you think he meant by that?
Pause. At the time, Tony, I thought it was just the romantic notion of a young man who'd spent too much time alone in the mountains. But now, looking back after all these years, I wonder if JM understood something about our valley that the rest of us had forgotten.
You mentioned earlier that your village had been there for generations. Had anyone ever found symbols like these before?
That's what started eating at me, Tony. My grandmother used to tell stories about the old builders who'd lived in these mountains before our people arrived. We'd always treated them as fairy tales, but after seeing JM's work, I started remembering details from those stories I'd dismissed as fantasy.
What kind of details?
She used to say the old builders could speak to stone, make it soft like clay in their hands, that they'd left messages carved in secret places, waiting for someone who could understand them. As a child, I'd search every cave and cliff face looking for those carvings, but I never found anything.
Do you think JM found something in those mountains that the rest of you had missed?
Tony, I think JM found exactly what he was meant to find. The question that haunted me then, and still haunts me now, is whether he went looking for it or whether it was looking for him.
That's a profound distinction, guest. Tell me about how this affected your relationship with JM personally.
Sighs. I'd been like an uncle to that boy, Tony. After his parents died in the winter sickness when he was 12, I was one of the few adults who encouraged his building projects. But when he came back from the mountains, it felt like I was speaking to a stranger wearing JM's face.
That must have been painful for you.
It was like losing him twice, Tony. First when he disappeared, then when he returned as someone I barely recognized. I remember trying to talk to him about his childhood projects, thinking it might bring back the boy I'd known. He listened politely, but there was this distance in his eyes, like he was looking at memories that belonged to someone else.
Did you ever ask him directly about what happened to him during those 3 months?
I tried, Tony. One evening, I found him sitting by the old oak where he used to play as a child. I sat down beside him and asked if he missed being that carefree boy. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I'll never forget.
What did he say?
He said, "I remember being that boy, but it feels like remembering a story someone told me about a stranger. The mountains showed me who I really am and who I've always been." Then he looked at me with such sadness and added, "I'm sorry I can't be him for you anymore."
How did you respond to that?
Pause. I didn't know how to respond, Tony. Part of me wanted to shake him, to demand he explain what he meant. But there was something in his voice, a kind of ancient weariness, that made me realize pushing would only drive him further away.
It sounds like you were grieving, guest. Grieving the loss of the boy you'd helped raise.
That's exactly what it was, Tony. I was mourning someone who was sitting right next to me, alive and healthy, but somehow unreachable. And the hardest part was seeing glimpses of the old JM sometimes, little moments when his face would light up or he'd laugh at something, and for a second it was like nothing had changed.
How did the other villagers handle this transformation in JM?
Some of them were frightened, Tony. They started treating him like he might be dangerous, crossing to the other side of the path when they saw him coming. Others were fascinated, following him around hoping to witness something extraordinary. But I think the worst part for JM was how few people just treated him like a person anymore.
And what about the fortress itself? How did the village ultimately decide what to do with it?
That became the real battleground, Tony. The symbols weren't just decorative, they seemed to be growing. Every few days, someone would notice new markings that hadn't been there before. JM insisted he wasn't adding them, that they were appearing on their own.
Did you believe him?
Long pause, Tony. I wanted to believe there was a rational explanation. But I spent a whole night watching one wall of that fortress, and by dawn there were 3 new symbols that I swear hadn't been there when the sun set.
That must have been terrifying.
Terrifying and beautiful, Tony. The symbols seemed to pulse with their own inner light in the darkness, and the strangest thing was, looking at them didn't feel foreign or threatening. It felt like coming home to a place I'd never been but had always known.
It sounds like the fortress was changing you too, guest.
Maybe it was, Tony. Or maybe it was just helping me remember something I'd always carried but had learned to ignore. Either way, I started understanding why JM seemed so different. Once you've seen magic work in the world, it's hard to pretend the world is ordinary.
Guest, we've been talking about young JM's remarkable construction skills, but I sense there's something deeper troubling you about those symbols carved into the walls. What happened when the villagers first saw them?
Long pause. That's when everything changed, Tony. Old Henrik was the first to notice them. He'd been running his weathered hands along the stone walls, marveling at JM's craftsmanship, when his fingers found those deep grooves. The symbols were carved with such precision, such deliberate care.
Henrik recognized them, didn't he?
His face went white as winter snow, started muttering in the old tongue, words most of us hadn't heard since we were children listening to our grandmother's stories. He kept saying something about the Watchers of the Stone, the ancient guardians who once protected these mountains.
How did JM react to Henrik's recognition?
That boy, Tony. He just stood there with this strange calm about him. Not surprised, not defensive. Almost like he'd been waiting for someone to finally understand. When Henrik asked him where he'd learned to carve those particular symbols, JM said something that still gives me chills.
What did he say?
I learned from the mountain itself. Pause, just like that. Matter of fact as discussing the weather. Henrik pressed him, wanted to know if he'd found ruins up there, ancient texts, something to explain his knowledge. But JM shook his head and said the strangest thing.
Tell me.
He said the symbols came to him in dreams. Night after night while he was building, he'd dream of hands guiding his chisel, showing him exactly where each mark should go. Said he could feel the mountain's memory flowing through the stone, teaching him what had been forgotten.
How did the other villagers respond to this revelation?
Fear, mostly. You have to understand, guest, we mountain folk have long memories. Our great-grandparents spoke of things that walked these peaks before our people arrived, of powers that should remain undisturbed. Some families packed up that very day and moved down to the valley towns.
But others stayed?
A few of us did. We were torn between terror and wonder. Here was this boy, barely old enough to court a girl, claiming he'd been taught by the mountain's own spirit. Yet we'd seen his impossible fortress with our own eyes. The precision of those joints, the way the structure seemed to grow from the living rock itself.
What did Henrik believe?
Old Henrik, he'd studied the ancient ways more than any of us. He pulled me aside that evening and told me something that's haunted me for 40 years. He said those symbols weren't just decoration or even protection. They were a calling card, a message to whatever dwelt in the deep places of the mountain.
A message saying what?
That JM had been chosen. Pause. Henrik believed the boy had been marked by something old and powerful, something that had been waiting in those peaks for the right person to find it. The symbols were proof of that connection, that awakening.
Did you believe Henrik's interpretation?
I wanted to dismiss it as an old man's superstition, Tony. But then JM started changing before our very eyes. He'd always been a thoughtful boy, but now he carried himself differently, spoke with an authority that seemed borrowed from centuries of experience. Sometimes you'd catch him staring at the peaks with recognition, like he was seeing old friends.
What kind of changes did you notice specifically?
He knew things he shouldn't have known. Weather patterns weeks in advance, where to find water during the dry season, which paths through the mountains were safe, and which held danger. Maria Solis's grandmother was dying of a fever that summer, and JM appeared at their door with herbs none of us had seen before.
Did the herbs help?
Saved her life. When Maria asked where he'd learned such healing knowledge, JM said the mountain had shown him, said every plant, every root had a story to tell if you knew how to listen. That's when I realized we weren't dealing with just a gifted builder anymore.
You were seeing someone who'd been fundamentally changed by his experience up there.
Exactly. And the most unsettling part, Tony, was how natural it all seemed to him. Like he was finally becoming who he'd always been meant to be. But for those of us who'd known him since birth, watching little JM transform into something beyond our understanding, it felt like we were losing the boy we'd loved and gaining something we weren't sure we could trust.
That must have created a terrible tension in your community.
It did. And that tension was about to tear our village apart in ways none of us could have imagined.
Guest, we've been talking about young JM's incredible fortress, but I sense there's something you haven't told me yet. Something that changes everything.
Long pause, you're perceptive, Tony. Yes, there is something. Something the villagers discovered that final day in the mountain.
What did they find?
It wasn't what they found exactly. It was what JM told us, about why he really went up there. Pause about what called him.
Called him?
That's the word he used. JM said he'd been having dreams for months before he left. Dreams of stone walls and ancient voices speaking in a language he didn't understand, but somehow knew.
And you believed him?
At first we thought it was just a boy's imagination. You know how young people romanticize their adventures. But then he showed us something.
What was it?
He led us to the deepest chamber of the fortress, one we hadn't seen before. The walls were covered in symbols, Tony. Not carved recently, but old, ancient, weathered by centuries.
But guest, if they were ancient, how could JM have known about them from his dreams?
That's exactly what his father asked. And JM's answer. Pause. His answer changed everything we thought we knew about that boy.
Tell me what he said.
He said the symbols had always been there, waiting. That when he started building, his hands just knew where to place each stone to uncover them. Like he was uncovering something that already existed rather than creating something new.
That sounds impossible.
That's what we thought. Until old Henrik, the village historian, recognized some of the symbols.
From where?
From stories his grandmother told him. Stories about the mountain families who lived up there generations ago. Families who disappeared one winter and were never seen again.
What kind of stories?
Henrik said they were builders, Tony. Master stoneworkers who could create structures that seemed to defy nature itself. They had knowledge passed down through bloodlines, knowledge of reading the mountain's own patterns.
Are you suggesting that JM somehow inherited this knowledge?
Pause. We didn't know what to think. Until JM's mother spoke up.
What did she say?
She'd never told anyone, not even her husband, but her maiden name was Bergman, mountain man. Her great-great-grandmother had been found as a child, alone in the woods, with no memory of her family.
The timeline would fit.
Exactly. And suddenly, JM's impossible achievement began to make sense. Not supernatural sense, but human sense, deep ancestral sense.
How did JM react to learning this?
He wasn't surprised, Tony. He said he'd always felt different, like he understood things about stone and earth that others didn't. When his mother revealed the family connection, he just nodded and said it explained the voices in his dreams.
What were the voices telling him?
To remember, to rebuild, to continue what had been interrupted all those years ago when his ancestors vanished from the mountain.
And the villagers accepted this explanation?
Some did. Others thought it was too convenient, too mystical. But then JM demonstrated something that silenced the doubters.
What did he do?
He placed his hands on a seemingly solid wall and found a hidden mechanism none of us had noticed. A section of stone swiveled inward, revealing a chamber filled with tools, ancient tools, perfectly preserved.
Tools that matched the craftsmanship of the fortress?
Identical, Tony. As if JM's ancestors had left them there, waiting for someone of their bloodline to return and claim their inheritance.
How did this revelation change how people saw JM?
Fear, mostly. Not of JM himself, but of what his abilities represented. If one boy could unlock such secrets accidentally, what else might be hidden in our mountains? What other bloodlines carried forgotten knowledge?
And how did it change JM?
That's the most profound part, Tony. For the first time in his life, JM understood himself. He wasn't just a strange boy who preferred solitude. He was a keeper of ancient knowledge, a bridge between past and present.
Did he stay in the village after that?
For a while. But the mountain called to him more strongly than ever. He said there were other sites up there, other places where his ancestors had worked, other memories waiting to be awakened.
So this story isn't really about a boy building a fortress?
No, Tony. It's about inheritance. About how some knowledge runs so deep in the blood that it can lie dormant for generations and still emerge when the time is right. It's about the mountain itself choosing when to reveal its secrets.
And choosing who can receive them.
Exactly. JM didn't build that fortress, Tony. He remembered it.
Guest, we've been talking about JM's remarkable fortress for 11 chapters now, but I have to ask something that's been troubling me. How exactly did you come to know all these intimate details about what happened in those mountains?
Long pause, I wondered when you'd asked that question, Tony. I suppose I've been dancing around the truth long enough.
What do you mean by that?
The villagers, the ancient symbols, the 3 months in the mountains. I've been telling you this story as if I witnessed it from the outside, but that's not entirely honest.
Are you saying you were there?
I'm saying more than that, Tony, much more. Pause, my name isn't what I told you when we started these conversations.
I'm not sure I understand.
16 years old, basic hand tools, 3 months alone building something impossible. Tony, I am JM. I was JM. That frightened, determined boy who disappeared into those mountains 60 years ago.
Silence. You're telling me you built that fortress yourself?
Every stone, every carving, every impossible arch. These aren't stories someone told me, Tony. They're memories burned into my soul. When I described the weight of those stones, the ache in my shoulders, the moment I first touched those ancient symbols, I was remembering my own hands, my own pain, my own terror.
But why present it as someone else's story? Why not just tell me it was your experience from the beginning?
Because at 16 I thought I was building a home. At 76, I understand I was awakening something that should have remained sleeping. The villagers weren't just shocked by the craftsmanship, Tony. They were terrified of what I'd become.
What you'd become?
The symbols didn't just appear under my tools by accident. They chose me, guided my hands, whispered instructions in languages I'd never learned. I returned to that village as something other than the boy who'd left.
And now, 60 years later?
Now I'm an old man telling stories to warn people about the price of ambition. That fortress still stands, Tony. Those symbols still pulse with power on certain nights. And sometimes, when the mountain wind blows just right, I can still hear them calling my name.
Calling you back?
Always calling me back.
Guest, we've heard how the villagers discovered those ancient symbols in JM's fortress. What happened when they realized the mountain itself was responding to his presence?
Long pause. That's when everything changed, Tony. The elders called an emergency gathering that very night. I remember old Henrik's hands shaking as he spoke about legends his grandmother had whispered to him as a boy.
What kind of legends?
Stories about the mountain being a guardian, a keeper of something that was sealed away centuries ago. Henrik said his grandmother always warned that if the mountain ever chose someone, it would mean the old protections were weakening.
And they believed JM was this chosen person?
The evidence was impossible to ignore. That fortress wasn't just built by a 16-year-old boy, Tony. The precision, the ancient knowledge embedded in every stone. The symbols weren't carved by JM's hand, they were revealed through his work.
How did the village react to this revelation?
Pause, fear, mostly. But also a strange kind of reverence. Some wanted to seal off the fortress completely, pretend none of this had happened. Others argued we needed to understand what JM had awakened before it was too late.
And where was JM during these discussions?
That's what made it all more unsettling. He'd grown so quiet, Tony. The boy who'd returned to us 3 months ago was already different. But now he seemed to be listening to something only he could hear. He'd stand at the edge of conversations, nodding as if he understood things we couldn't even imagine.
Did anyone try to talk to him directly about what he was experiencing?
His father tried. I watched Thomas approach his own son like he was approaching a wild animal. JM looked at him with such ancient eyes and said something that chilled us all.
What did he say?
It's time to finish what was started. The mountain has been patient long enough.
Pause. How did the village prepare for whatever was coming?
Some families started packing, ready to flee if necessary. Others gathered what few old texts and artifacts we had, hoping to find guidance. But deep down, we all knew there was no running from this. Whatever JM had awakened in that mountain, whatever ancient compact he'd become part of, our fate was tied to his now.
And JM himself? How was he preparing?
He spent those final hours before everything changed, sitting alone in his fortress, waiting.
So guessed, as JM prepared to face whatever force was awakening in that mountain, what was going through his mind?
Pause. You know, Tony, I think that boy was wrestling with something most folks our age understand better now. The weight of responsibility when you're the only one who can act.
That's a heavy burden for anyone, let alone a 16-year-old. How did he steel himself for what was coming?
He spent that last evening walking through every room of his fortress, touching the stones he'd placed with his own hands. But it wasn't nostalgia, Tony. He was saying goodbye.
Goodbye to his creation?
To his childhood, really. See, when those symbols started glowing brighter each night, when the mountain began that low humming that made your teeth ache, JM knew he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross.
The villagers must have sensed something was building too.
Oh, they felt it all right. Dogs wouldn't stop howling. Wells started running muddy. Old Henrik swore his compass spun like a child's top. But JM, he just sat there sharpening his tools, calm as still water.
What was his plan, guest? How do you prepare for something that defies understanding?
Long pause. That's just it, Tony. He told me later he realized you can't plan for the impossible. You just have to trust what's inside you.
Trust what, exactly?
The same instinct that guided his hands when he carved those symbols. The same voice that whispered where to place each stone. JM was beginning to understand he'd been chosen for this long before he picked up that first chisel.
That must have been terrifying and comforting at the same time.
Exactly. Like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing you have to jump, but somehow trusting there'll be ground beneath your feet.
Did he share any of this burden with the villagers?
He tried to send them away, Tony. Told them to go home, lock their doors, wait for sunrise. But you know how village folk are when they sense something momentous.
They stayed.
Every last one, and I think, deep down, JM was grateful. Because what was coming wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all of us, and the choice between hiding from ancient powers or facing them with courage.
So there they stood, at the threshold of something that would change everything.
Yes. Waiting for the mountain to reveal its final secret.
So, guest, we've reached the moment when JM faced the mountain's deepest secret. What was going through his mind as those ancient symbols began to glow?
Tony, I think that 16-year-old boy finally understood he wasn't just building a fortress. He was completing something that had waited centuries for the right hands, the right heart.
The villagers were terrified, weren't they? Watching this child they thought they knew transform before their eyes.
Terrified, yes, but also witnessing something sacred. JM turned to Elder Marcus and said, "You always told us our ancestors were simple mountain folk, but they were guardians, weren't they?" Pause. The old man's silence was answer enough.
How did JM find the courage to embrace what was happening to him?
He looked at those glowing walls he'd built with his own hands and realized the mountain had been teaching him all along. Every stone he'd placed, every timber he'd shaped. He said, "I thought I was running away from who I was meant to be, but I was running toward it."
And the choice the mountain presented to him?
The symbols weren't just decoration, Tony. They were a test, a calling. JM could seal the ancient knowledge away forever or accept the responsibility of being its keeper, a burden that had crushed stronger men than a 16-year-old boy.
What did his father say in that moment?
Long pause. Thomas stepped forward, tears in his eyes, and admitted, "I tried to protect you from this legacy, son. My grandfather bore these secrets until they broke him. I wanted you to have a simple life."
But JM had already made his decision.
He placed his hands on the central stone and said, "Maybe simple lives aren't meant for everyone, Father. Maybe some of us are meant to carry the weight so others can sleep peacefully." The glow intensified, accepting him.
How did that change him?
In that instant, JM aged beyond his years. Not physically, but in his eyes. He looked at the villagers and said, "The fortress will protect us all now, but I must stay here, become part of what I've built." He'd found his purpose, Tony.
The boy who ran to the mountains to escape responsibility had become their greatest guardian.
Exactly. Sometimes we don't choose our destiny. Sometimes we simply stop running from it.
So Guest, when JM faced that choice in the fortress between the power the symbols offered and protecting his village, what do you think went through his mind?
Pause. You know, Tony, I believe he saw himself clearly for the first time. Here was this boy who'd spent months pouring his heart into creation, only to discover he'd been manipulated by forces beyond his understanding.
That must have been devastating. How does a 16-year-old process that kind of betrayal?
He looked at his neighbors, Tony, saw their fear, their trust in him. The symbols promised him knowledge, strength, the ability to reshape the world. But in that moment, he chose love over power.
What happened when he made that choice?
He pressed his hands against the ancient carvings and spoke a single word: "Forgive." The fortress began to crumble, the symbols fading like smoke. But Guest, something beautiful happened. As the stone fell away, it revealed the most exquisite natural cave beneath, untouched and pure.
He chose to preserve rather than possess.
Exactly. True mastery, he learned, sometimes means knowing when to let go.
So Guest, as we wrap up this remarkable tale, what do you think JM truly found up there in those mountains?
I believe he found himself, Tony. The fortress was extraordinary, yes, but watching that boy transform from our quiet mountain child into someone who could unite our entire village, that was the real miracle.
The ancient symbols he carved, do they still trouble the villagers?
Thoughtful pause. Less so now. We've learned they weren't warnings of danger, but reminders of connection. To the earth, to each other, to something greater than ourselves.
Has JM shared what drove him to disappear for those 3 months?
He told his father he felt called to build something lasting, something that would bring people together rather than keep them apart. The boy succeeded beyond anyone's imagination.
And the village now?
Changed, Tony. Forever changed. We gather at the fortress for celebrations, for decisions, for quiet reflection. JM gave us more than stone walls. He gave us a heart.
A remarkable legacy for someone so young.
Indeed.
So here we are, Guest, at the end of this remarkable tale. When you think back to that frightened village 3 months ago, what strikes you most?
The silence, Tony. How quickly fear can make people forget wonder. We were so terrified of losing JM that we nearly missed the miracle he'd created.
And now, how has your village changed since discovering his fortress?
We're different people. JM showed us that impossible things live right next to us, waiting. The young ones ask different questions now. They look at the mountains with new eyes.
What about those ancient symbols? Do they still trouble you?
Long pause. Some mysteries are meant to stay mysteries, Tony. We learned that wisdom and power aren't the same thing. J.M. understood that from the beginning.
If someone asked you what this story teaches, what would you tell them?
That miracles often come disguised as ordinary boys with extraordinary hearts. And sometimes the greatest gift is knowing when to stop digging.